Tonight on Primetime Politics, no documents, no progress. As Conservatives hold up government business for another day, the Green Party leader calls out the official opposition.
It's an enormous waste of time and waste of money.
Coming up, we will speak with Elizabeth May and find out why she doesn't believe the accusations of corruption that we're hearing from the Tory benches. Also,
the word tariff, properly used, is a beautiful word. One of the most beautiful words.
We'll look at the impact of the U.S. election campaign and what a Trump or Harris victory could mean for the Canadian economy. And
as one of your first steps, we got to work together.
Because John just wants to take us back to the 20th century.
with 10 days left in the BC campaign, we'll get reaction from last night's leaders' debate. This is Primetime Politics. Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Serapio. A debate over documents in a recently terminated Green Fund continues to paralyze the House of Commons, Conservatives wanting those documents full and unredacted to be handed over to the RCMP, believing they will expose Liberal corruption. But the Trudeau Liberals are not conceding, citing charter concerns, and that means all other government business is stalled until this matter of privilege is resolved.
Last week, she claimed that the government had given documents to the RCMP. This week, they claim that if they gave documents to the RCMP, it would cause the Charter of Rights to come crashing down. It sounds like there's a new story every week to justify paralyzing Parliament to cover up the truth. What is in these documents about this $400 million scandal that the Prime Minister is so afraid of?
This is a typical witch hunt from the leader of the opposition to go after people who have nothing to do with this. These are files such as personnel files that contain private information of individuals who have nothing to do with what is going on. Mr. Speaker, it is the RCMP and the Auditor General themselves who raise concerns with this motion, and it is the government's view that we should send this to committee so that we can get on with the important work of this House and protect the rights of Canadians.
Well, with more on this parliamentary impasse, we're now joined by the leader of the Green Party, Elizabeth May. Ms. May, thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for having me, Michael.
Listen, you spoke ahead of QP today, and you described what's happening right now in the Commons as an enormous waste of time and a waste of money. But, you know, for Conservatives, they argue they're trying to get documents which could expose Liberal corruption. Inconvenient as it is it not worthwhile to do that?
Well, we already have with the documents and the Auditor General's report enough information to know that it doesn't expose Liberal corruption. What we do have is absolutely, on the face of it, an unacceptable failure of the system to prevent conflict of interest decision-making within the board of Sustainable Development Technology Canada. Absolutely, we should get to the bottom of that. We should continue the work with the Auditor General and the Commissioner for Environment and Sustainable Development within the Office of the Auditor General. So what we know, Michael, is that during the COVID pandemic, a chair of the board of an organization that had existed since Jean Chrétien set it up, and I have to say it was well administered and well run when Stephen Harper was Prime Minister. It delivered seed funding to help start up technologies that were not yet proven so that they could get into the marketplace. So that's Sustainable Development Technology Canada. It has since been shut down, and the function, which is important to get this kind of money to emerging technologies in Canada, has now been taken over by the National Research Council. The unacceptable period occurred under the chairmanship of someone appointed by former Industry Minister Navdeep Bain. I can't find anything that suggests she was a Liberal Party supporter. She was appointed to an Economic Advisory Council by Stephen Harper. She was an advisor to Jim Flaherty, to former Prime Minister, the late Brian Mulroney. She was a very impressive, and it's not like she's passed away. She just has a reputation that's in tatters. She's a very impressive, self-made businesswoman in Canada who'd been the head of Home Depot and once appointed as chair of the board of Sustainable Development Technology Canada, inexplicably, as far as I can see, forgot 101 ethics. If you're sitting on a board, you don't approve money to your own company. This is basic, but it isn't. It's being blown up in a way that makes me uncomfortable in Parliament. And it also, of course, I think, again, if the House of Commons asks for documents, the government should absolutely turn over all the documents. There are ways to handle this that are other than grinding Parliament to a halt. Sending the whole thing to committee now would certainly be helpful. We could shine quite a lot of light on this controversy with existing documents, with the Auditor General's existing reports, and what we know about what transpired.
If that goes to committee, when you say you're finding it hard to find the accusations and what you're seeing, the accusations being made by Conservatives, so what then do you make of the government argument that Conservatives are essentially playing political games right now?
Well, I mean, clearly everybody is. I don't understand why. I don't see, and I don't, unfortunately, I admit this right off the top, Michael, I don't buy Karina Gould's argument that this is a charter infringement. The Parliament of Canada has the right to request documents, and documents should be turned over to the Parliament of Canada when requested. I don't think that's open to debate. It isn't likely, from what I've seen from the RCMP review so far and from any public comments from the RCMP, there isn't at this point an allegation of any criminality. I don't really see, given that I've gone through the Auditor General's report, the Commissioner for Environment and Sustainable Development report, at this point, unless there's something to come to light, and I can't begin to imagine what it would be actually, that could amount to criminality. Money went to companies that exaggerated what they would do for the environment with the funds they got. A lot of these companies are companies like Suncor and oil sands companies that exaggerated the benefits of carbon capture and storage. That's one of the things the Conservatives would want to fund, because they keep saying technology is the solution and not carbon pricing. It's amazing to have so much hot air in Parliament about climate when none of it actually addresses the climate crisis. So, in short, yes, both sides are playing politics. I think it's an overreach to suggest that turning over the documents would violate anyone's charter rights. By all means, the government should turn over the documents, but I don't think that Parliament needs to grind to a halt on this question of possible infringement of privilege when we could send it straight to committee and begin the work there so that Parliament could get on with passing much needed legislation which is stuck in the queue.
And to be clear for people at home, everybody's agreed to let committee look at this except for the Conservatives at this point. But you're talking about politics not only from the government but from the official opposition as well. So that does underline a bit of the toxicity that we've seen ever since Parliament came back last month. Do you think it is time then to dissolve this House and hold another election?
No, I don't. I mean, right now, by the way, all of my constituents are rather involved in picking the new government for the government of British Columbia. We're in an election in British Columbia, we're in an election in New Brunswick, we're in an election in Saskatchewan. And right now, I think Canadians did elect a government. And of course, there's 5 parties in Parliament. We don't elect a prime minister. And the focus is always on, well, we've had enough of Justin Trudeau. Let's move on and pick the next guy. Wait a minute. We elect a Parliament. We have 5 parties right now operating in the Parliament of Canada. And for the most part, we are able to cooperate and get things done. I love it when we really do cooperate and get things done. But there's legislation that my constituents, there's put forward by the Minister of Transport, to give you one example, because it doesn't get much airtime, Bill C-33 for railway safety and to improve the management in our harbors and ports. I was successful in getting some amendments to that bill through. It's sitting in the queue waiting for 3rd reading. A report stage we haven't even gotten through, and 3rd reading. Then it has to go to the Senate. The amount of waste of time and energy from everyone involved to advance legislation that the country needs, because we've been in an endless cycle of hyperbolic hyperpartisanship, is really unhelpful. And I don't think it's time for an election, because well, obviously, 3 provinces would be significantly disadvantaged in terms of their democratic process if we pulled the plug on this government tomorrow.
Ms. May, I only have a minute left, but I do have to ask you, because I'm sure you saw that article in the Journal de Montréal questioning whether or not you are ready to lead the Greens once again into another federal campaign. Are you ready to do that, considering how hard a campaign can be?
No, of course I am. I was rather, I was surprised that the reporter didn't ask me the question and relied on who knows who anonymous people. I am extraordinarily fit. I am able to do a workload that would crush someone half my age. I am very, very fortunate, and I'm not the least bit worried about my health going into another federal election campaign.
Ms. May, always good to speak with you. Thank you for that.
By the way, Michael, I'm blessed that I can say such a thing. I am very, very lucky, and I know it. And that's why I have the work I have to do. I'm quite certain I have to do that work because I'm here and capable of doing it.
Well, I'm glad you're on our program expressing that. Elizabeth May, thank you for the time.
Thank you.
Well, time now for a look at what happened in politics.
First, it is against international law, period. Second, we need to make sure that there's a proportionate response by Israel to, of course, an attack that they were victims of by Iran.
Well, that is the Foreign Affairs Minister Mélanie Joly responding today to remarks made by the Conservative leader on Monday. In that remark, Pierre Poilievre saying he supports potential Israeli airstrikes against Iranian nuclear sites.
Israel must be able to prevent Iran from using nuclear weapons if necessary. That means proactively striking Iranian nuclear sites and oil installations.
Pierre Poilievre made the comment at an October 7 event. Today, Joly reiterated her government's opposition to such a strike, pointing out the U.S. President Joe Biden has already said he is against the idea. The public inquiry into foreign interference heard from the Prime Minister's National Security Advisor, Nathalie Drouin, today, who says she is uncomfortable with the impression left by the NSICOP report on foreign interference. That report, released in March, suggested there were past and present MPs who wittingly or unwittingly aided foreign entities. Drouin says that creates the impression of treason, but speaking in French, says she saw no MPs responsible for espionage, sabotage, or putting the security of Canada at risk. And finally, Canada will be giving an additional $15 million for humanitarian assistance in Lebanon. That announcement made today by the International Development Minister Ahmed Hussein. He also says Ottawa will match donations made by Canadians through select organizations until November the 3rd and up to $6 million. Officials in Lebanon estimate that over 1 million people have been displaced in the country since the beginning of Israel's military campaign against the militant group Hezbollah. The British Columbia campaign is now in its final stretch, with party leaders taking part in a televised debate last night. Now, that event saw the BC NDP and Green leaders hitting the BC Conservative leader pretty hard, and John Rustad answering back with hit after hit on David Eby's record as BC Premier.
And now he says he's going to get tough on crime. Give me a break.
It's fascinating to me that John Rustad's vision for this province is one that's rooted somewhere around 1957. I mean, he cannot look ahead because he can only look back.
John, you haven't released a costed platform. An economist at UBC says your platform is written in pixie dust.
And I will ask you this. In 7 years of NDP government, has anything been better? There's so much that needs to be done on healthcare, and it's not happening under David Eby.
Well, to talk about this, we're now joined by Mo Amir. He is a political commentator, podcaster, and host of This is VANCOLOUR. He has interviewed all the leaders at different times on his program. Mo, always good to have you. Thank you for joining us.
Michael, the pleasure's all mine. Thanks for having me.
Listen, I'm going to start here with your own social media post on last night's debate, because on X, this is what you said. David Eby, Crown prosecutor trying to convict on all charges. First to know, philosopher queen giving a dissertation on wealth and inequality. Rudstad guy who sees a problem and says we need to solve the problem, so it's not a problem because the problem is bad. So, building on what you wrote, I understand when you're talking about the Conservative leader, my take of what you wrote is that you heard no solutions last night from him. Is that fair to say?
When it comes to John Rustad, I think viewers of last night's debate heard a lot of concepts of a plan. And I would argue that, yeah, it lacked a lot of solutions, or basically the how of how to get things done. And I'll give you a quick example. In talking about the linkage between drug addiction and homelessness, moderator Shachi Kurl actually had to reiterate a question to Mr. Rustad about how his plan might drive people to homelessness. And Rustad's response was basically that he would house the homeless, he would get treatment for people suffering from addictions, and he would get mental health supports for people with mental health issues. These are not really solutions, right? Basically what he's doing is he's taking the problem, re-inverting it with the result he wants, but he's missing the how. And this was a pattern that repeated itself, and it was particularly pronounced because Mr. Rustad, as David Eby noted, and noted again and again, the Conservatives don't have a costed platform to which they can refer.
So no costed platform, and that certainly was an issue last night. So you mentioned David Eby there. Let's pick up, because you called him a Crown prosecutor attacking John Rustad, but on his own, he needs to address his own record. And we were talking to a public opinion researcher yesterday who basically described Eby as getting caught up in this whirlwind that the rest of the country is experiencing. People not necessarily just worried about their jobs, but worried about getting ahead in the years to come. How well was Eby able to defend his record and answer those types of concerns?
I think this is the masterful art of David Eby. You know, in any sort of public performance, one of the key things that you have to do is hide your weaknesses. And so Eby was very effective in being able to deflect from his own record and really attack John Rustad on two fronts. The first front being John Rustad's history in government with the BC Liberal government, where Eby highlighted a lot of different service cuts. And the second front was John Rustad's credibility as a future premier. He really went after things like the conspiracy theories, the climate change denial, the vaccine denial, and he was basically making the case that this person is not suitable for office. In terms of the economic discussion, there wasn't actually a clear economic discussion in the debate, but there were issues certainly around housing, housing affordability, building more housing, but there wasn't, Eby didn't really project any grand vision of economic prosperity that I think a lot of people were hoping to find from him.
Yeah, and it's interesting because when you look at the polling, and when people talk about the polling, they talk about this tight race between Conservatives and New Democrats. But in the debate last night was Sonia Furstenau, who is the Green Party leader in British Columbia, and she, along with her party, really hoping to be kingmakers here, getting enough seats to be the deciding bloc in any minority government. Do you think she made a strong enough argument for herself and her fellow Greens?
I think Sonia Furstenau's debate performance was very strong. I think she tried to create some contrast between herself and the other two candidates. And basically, you know, she was focused on things like wealth and inequity and a conversation around that. Again, referring to my tweet that you had referred to earlier. But ultimately, I keep seeing this commentary that Sonia Furstenau won the debate, although I don't agree with her policies. And so there seems to be this attitude that, you know, she did really well, but will it have a bounce in the polls? I'm not sure. And I would liken it to this idea of a blockbuster film that everyone goes and pays to see money for, maybe multiple times, versus a film that does really well on the award circuit. You know, us critics and political wonks, we can look at the merits of the debate and say, yeah, Sonia Furstenau won. But I think ultimately, David Eby was the blockbuster film here. He was a very crafty debater. He really put the pressure on Rustad. And I don't know if that's going to be, I don't know if Sonia did enough to dissuade NDP voters onto her side.
Okay, well, there are now just 10 days left in this campaign. What are you watching out for at this point?
I mean, wouldn't a BC Conservative costed platform be nice? Wouldn't that be nice to have so we can actually compare the plans between the parties? I am looking for that. I don't know when that's going to drop. I'm also interested to see if the NDP rolls out another attack next week in the last stretch of this election campaign. They definitely had a big attack against John Rustad, who was caught on camera seeming to support this idea of a quote-unquote Nuremberg 2.0, where he was talking to some anti-vax folks and basically saying that he would support the prosecution of people who gave vaccine mandates, both on a governmental level, but even journalists as well. So I'm interested to see if there's more Oppo research that comes out. But ultimately, I'm curious to see how the Conservatives rebound. You know, they had a tough week, and John Rustad's been dodging the media. He's been dodging debates. I was actually supposed to moderate a debate next week for the University of British Columbia. Rustad pulled out of that. So it'll be interesting to see what their strategy is in this home stretch.
Okay, well, we continue to watch. Always appreciate your insight, Mo Amir. Thank you for this.
Michael, thank you so much. Take care.
You too. We are now just 27 days away from the election south of the border. Polls at this point still showing a very tight race between Democratic nominee Kamala Harris and the Republican nominee, former U.S. President Donald Trump. Not surprisingly, Canadians are watching closely as well for a number of reasons, among them economic, as we are hearing some very protectionist language being used in the American campaign.
And we will take in hundreds of billions of dollars into our treasury and use that money to benefit the American citizens. And it will not cause inflation, by the way.
Now, that talk of tariffs would certainly have an impact on Canada's economy, but the U.S. economy would also be hit, a fact highlighted by a new report from the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. Trevor Tombe is a professor of economics at the University of Calgary. He authored that report and joins us right now. Trevor, good to see you. Thank you for being with us.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Listen, let's start by saying that, you know, both candidates have expressed some protectionist ideas, but Donald Trump really receiving the bulk of the attention given his talk about this 10% tariff on anything not made in the United States. How much of an impact would that actually have on the Canadian economy if Trump were to win and that tariff imposed?
Well, a 10% across-the-board tariff on everything brought into the United States from abroad would not only have economic implications for Canada, but would also be heavily disruptive for the U.S. economy as well. You know, it's not like we just trade goods that we specialize in and they trade goods that they specialize in. We produce goods and services oftentimes together using long and complicated and highly integrated supply chains that span the border. You know, roughly 12 cents of every dollar we export to the US actually originally came from the US in the form of an intermediate part that was produced there and sent here, and then we sent it back. So a tariff like this levied on everything would disrupt those kind of production processes and would lower productivity, which would shrink both of our economies. In the report released with the Chamber there, I estimate that it would shrink Canada's economy by about 0.9 to 1%, which might not sound like a lot, but that's about $30 billion per year in foregone economic output. And if we retaliate, as we did with steel and aluminum, if we retaliate with a similar 10% tariff on imports from them, then our economy shrinks by about 1.5 to 1.6%, while their economy shrinks by about 1%. So pretty significant economic costs for both countries.
Yeah, significant, as you say. And you also mentioned the earlier tariffs imposed, again, by the Trump administration on Canadian-made steel and aluminum. And it might be helpful to talk about that to help contextualize what we are facing right now. Just how badly did that hit both the U.S. and Canadian economies?
So that did have a much narrower economic effect, both in Canada and the United States, because it was targeted just on a particular set of goods. It affects consumers, but mainly because steel and aluminum are not things that you and I tend to buy directly. It affects us because it raises the cost of producing anything that uses that as an input, vehicles being a particular example, or machinery and equipment. And so it's something that absolutely lowers productivity, but it wasn't a permanent new feature of U.S. trade policy. It was something that I think it's fair to say at the time was kind of wrapped up more broadly in other types of trade negotiations and issues that the U.S. was pursuing, whereas this 10% tariff across the board does seem like it's being pitched as just a new reality. It would be a permanent feature of international trade with the United States.
Okay, so that is potentially what would happen if Donald Trump were to come in and basically introduce this tariff. But CUSMA, the renegotiated NAFTA, has to be reviewed in 2026. And as I said, we've heard protectionist language on both sides. What do Canadian industry and government leaders need to know about Kamala Harris and her trade policies if she should win?
Well, both major parties have moved in a more protectionist direction in recent years under successive administrations. We saw, even following the financial crisis, challenges for Canada around procurement as a part of the stimulus package under former President Obama. We see current President Biden, for example, escalating further the softwood lumber dispute and also creating some procurement challenges with new bills that they've introduced there. And so I think that if Kamala Harris were to become president, we would see, as we have been seeing, continued points of disagreement on specific issues, softwood lumber being an obvious one. There might be other issues raised as well. With the renewal in 2026, perhaps top of the list for Canada, no matter who wins, is going to be supply management. We have significant barriers to trade when it comes to certain basic, grocery items like dairy and poultry and eggs and so on. And that's a real source of concern for the United States. Wisconsin, for example, an important swing state, is a major dairy producer. And so both parties do have an interest in trying to liberalize the Canadian agricultural market. And so I think that's going to be one particular area to watch, again, regardless of who wins.
Mm-hmm. During the emergency phase of the COVID pandemic, there was protectionist discussion, given the recent history, having this kind of protectionist discussion, given the recent history of that.
Well, protectionism is not a new phenomenon among political leaders. It is very easy to point the finger at other countries as the cause of economic challenges within one's own. We do that in Canada as well. So part of this is not new. What COVID did reveal, though, is, I think, two important lessons to take away. On the one hand, there are some items where producing it domestically does provide a kind of insurance, because we had seen through the pandemic that the very physical capacity to ship goods internationally was itself disrupted. There was considerable supply chain bottlenecks following the pandemic. So for one, producing critical medical devices, vaccine, for example, having domestic production capacity there might be an argument on non-economic grounds to do that. But the importance of these supply chains, especially the very deep and complex and critical and reliable supply chains like between Canada and the United States, this is something where I think typical trade policy discussions in the political area especially do tend to miss that the economies are really deeply intertwined, and it's not straightforward at all, certainly not cheap to try and disentangle those supply chains. And so we need to keep in mind that Canada and the US economies are in many areas operating as one.
Trevor Tombe, really appreciate that. Thank you for that report. Trevor Tombe from the University of Calgary.
Thank you.
And that is Primetime Politics for this Wednesday. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. Primetime Politics is back tomorrow. Until then, take care.